He bought islands in other people's names. He bought awards, table positions at gala dinners, and favors at the highest levels. He turned state bonds into a private cash flow, then spent the country itself like an open bar. What he left behind was a ledger of vanished futures, schools that never opened, hospitals half-built, pensions cut to paper promises. This is the story of Victor Hale, how a charismatic, smooth-talking social climber became the architect of one of the most audacious financial plunders of a modern state, and how the masks he wore finally began to slip. Stay until the end, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Victor's earliest photograph in public life was taken on a gray campus day, one of those crisp October afternoons that make old stone look performant. He stood at the edge of the university lake, collar up against the wind, a new blazer that still smelled of the boutique where his mother bought it. In the photo, he smiles too wide for the weather, and someone later would tell investigators it was the smile of a man always auditioning for belonging. He came from a small port town where his father ran a modest shipping agency and his mother taught mathematics at the municipal school. There was no scandal in his childhood, no dramatic rags-to-riches twist to read into the biography. What mattered was performance training, elite summer camps, a scholarship to a prestigious boarding school where tutors praised his political sensibility, an internship at a firm where he learned how to bow just enough to be remembered. Every move was a small calibration toward a larger plan that, at first, even he may have thought would end at a comfortable, enviable life. Harrow-style evenings bled into Wharton hallways. He cultivated the precise accent that made donors nod. He learned which names opened doors and which phrases lulled trustees into complacency. That skill, networking as a craft, was his real capital. He did not inherit the machinery of power, he learned how to be given the keys. The first set piece that defined his persona came on a yacht. It was not a private press photo or a magazine shoot, it was a hastily staged moment at an intimate celebration for an oligarch's son. Photographer flashes caught the lacquer and chrome, the way the sun split on the champagne. Victor stood 2 people from the host, laughing at a joke he may not have heard. Later, in evidence photos turned over to investigators, someone noticed a detail. A family photograph on the yacht's sideboard had been swapped. Where a simple seaside portrait should have been, there was now a portrait of Victor with the minister's son, as if placement alone could rewrite intimacy. He cultivated ritual gestures, handshakes that lingered, private jokes that implied kinship, invitations that read like endorsements. To the wealthy and powerful, proximity itself became currency. He wore their confidence like a tailored coat and never looked back. By the time he founded his first investment vehicle, the documentary record shows that he had an uncanny ability to assemble credibility. A handful of former bank executives, a lawyer known for quiet resolve, and a celebrity socialite who stamped every invitation with an aura of glamour. These men and women lent him not only introductions, but reputational collateral. The firm's brochures were printed on heavy stock, the logo designed by a studio that builds celebrity endorsements. The narrative was simple and unmistakable. This was not a startup of amateurs. This was a trusted conduit between private wealth and public opportunity. The early deals were modest, the kind of joint ventures that sound boring in polite company but look essential on paper. Infrastructure projects, energy partnerships, a public-private model that promised efficiency and rapid delivery. He named one vehicle GoodStar, a joint venture that won a government contract to manage development funds in a region long starved of investment. On spreadsheets, the numbers seemed conservative. On ceremonial stages, ministers praised the new partnership model for bringing speed and capital to lagging projects. The first siphon was not cinematic. It began as an authorized disbursement, a line item moving from a sovereign trust account to a contractor with a familiar name. The contractor subcontracted portions offshore. The offshore entity then transferred funds to another entity with opaque ownership. Layers, in the investigators' later summation, served 2 purposes. They created plausible deniability and slowed any outside tracing. At each handoff, the paperwork became sloppier by design. Signed invoices with unfamiliar stamps, board minutes that were never posted, audits delayed on technical grounds. To the ministers who endorsed the venture, the logic was simple: speed requires flexibility. To the public, the missing projects were only an abstraction until roads stopped being paved and hospitals posted temporarily closed signs. Victor's method, at its core, relied on three things. First, he turned reputation into leverage, bringing prominent names to sign letters, join boards, and sit on panels, so that skepticism translated into social cost. Second, he used institutional gaps, weak oversight bodies, audits that operated on longer timelines than the cash flows he engineered. Third, he weaponized charm. Those around him often recalled his earnestness, his ability to make complex finances feel like a shared patriotic mission. When questioned later, many of the enablers said they had believed they were serving a national good. That belief, whether self-deceptive or deliberate, became cover. There are moments that, in hindsight, glitter like warning buoys. One such moment came at a celebratory dinner in a city hotel, where ministers, bank executives, and Hollywood-like talent toasted over oysters and domed silver. Victor rose to speak. His words were slick, a blend of free market aphorisms and sentimental patriotism. "We will bring the world in," he said. "We will show them how public ambition and private capital can dance." The applause was polite, the cameras approving. A journalist who later turned whistleblower would say the speech was a masterclass in misdirection, grandiose but vague, a rhetorical net that caught commitment more than accountability. As the funds under his control grew, so did the scale of indulgence. There were high-rolling weekends at casinos with lacquered tables and the brittle clack of chips. Weekends where the smell of cigars mixed with the salt of a private jet's leather cabin. He financed films that featured friends and allies, bought last-minute tickets to awards galas, and financed boutique charities where donations were visible and the social capital returned immediately. But ostentation was also camouflage. By financing movies and awards, he cultivated cultural capital that masked the dryness of balance sheets. The stars who sat at his tables rarely asked where the money came from. They asked what the money bought in terms of access. That lack of curiosity was part of the ecosystem that sustained him. The expansion phase began with bond issuances, large public debt offerings that promised liquidity for national development. These were the pivot. When sovereign entities issue bonds, they do so under public scrutiny, ratings, counsel, disclosure. Yet here the structure included a web of special-purpose vehicles and underwriters who were, at the time, seen as prestigious. A top-tier investment bank agreed to underwrite a tranche, partly because it would bring fees and partly because it offered entree into a new market. High-level explanations later produced by forensic accountants were careful. The bond proceeds should have flowed to long-term infrastructure. Instead, a portion was routed through intermediary vehicles, then into private accounts tied to shell corporations. Investigative journalists tracked payment chains that led to luxury real estate, to accounts in jurisdictions with secrecy laws, and to a set of trust accounts whose beneficiaries were masked by nominee directors. At every step, legal counsel produced memos that cited precedents and plausible legal frameworks. The result was a river of capital that took a different course from its public purpose. Not every buyer of his narrative was naive. Some bankers knew the risks and chose to participate because the fees justified their risk models. Some lawyers calculated that the legal battleground would be years away. And some politicians, hungry for fast, visible outcomes, were content to postpone skepticism while projects visibly began. Construction crews arrived, cranes were lifted, and photographs of groundbreaking ceremonies proliferated. Proof, in a world of cameras and press releases, often displaced rigorous accounting. By the time the first public hints of irregularity emerged, there were already complex human costs. In coastal provinces, planned clinics remained skeletal. Teachers who were promised raises found their payrolls delayed. Parents queued at clinics that recorded shortages. A small-town mayor who had backed the projects into his constituency found himself cornered by citizens who wanted answers. Where did the money go, they'd ask in community halls. The answer, at first, was bureaucratic gingerbread, Audits pending, contracts being renegotiated, forces beyond local control. Later, it would become the central question of national politics. Then came the leak. Leaks move like an act of weather, sudden, wholesale, and indifferent to polite boundaries. A batch of internal emails, dry and procedural at first glance, arrived in the hands of an investigative newsroom. They revealed inconsistencies, approval memos that referenced directions that did not appear in formal minutes, messages congratulating staff on swift execution as budget lines shifted, attachments with offhand notes about alternate payees. The emails did not prove crime by themselves, but they created a constellation of suspicion. The journalists, trained to triangulate, started to map transactions against public records. Donations to cultural events that had seemed philanthropic now lined up with payment dates from the same ventures. Pressure built quickly. Opposition leaders seized on the documents, and civil society organizations began to demand independent inquiries. Street protests ignited, not a national uprising, but a persistent cadence of demonstrations, petition drives, and municipal town halls. For the first time, Victor's carefully cultivated aura of competence encountered collective anger. Television panels were split between defenders who emphasized development timelines and critics who asked why funds meant for schools were funding film premieres. Inside his inner circle, cracks proliferated. Marcus Liu, his long-standing confidant and operations manager, began to voice reservations in private. "We're moving too fast," he told Victor in a late-night conversation on a private jet, the cabin lit in soft amber and the hum of the engines steady. "There are too many steps we can't justify on the books." Victor's reply was not a denial so much as a recalibration. "Speed is currency, Marcus. If we slow down, somebody else will step in. We are the ones building now." Marcus's silence after that conversation would later be interpreted as either complicity or resignation. There were other signs. Regulators sent queries that were answered with reams of documents. Auditors were requested to delay formal reports in exchange for cooperative transparency. A high-ranking minister who had championed the deals found himself publicly embarrassed when a transcript of a private conversation surfaced, suggesting he had been less thorough than he had publicly claimed. At that hinge, investors began to lose appetite. Credit ratings agencies, under pressure from the evolving narrative, issued warnings. The cost of refinancing rose. The nation faced the very real prospect that credit markets would take more than a cautionary step. They might close the tap. For Victor, the calculus narrowed. Either conceal the evidence and keep the machinery humming, or begin to unwind assets into vehicles that would survive scrutiny. It was a precarious moment, an inflection point where good governance should have intervened, but the safeguards were slow and fragmented. In many ways, the system itself was an accomplice. Regulatory agencies understaffed, legal frameworks unprepared for this scale of cross-border complexity, and political incentives aligned with short-term spectacle. Before the story could break into full public fever, a mid-roll interruption you would have heard in a broadcast, an advertiser asking for a quick word about budgeting your own financial life, would cut across the narrative. But this is not that interruption. It is a sober reminder. When institutions fail to protect public funds, ordinary citizens pay the price. Now, the investigation turns to the largest and most consequential series of transactions, bond issuances that would either enrich private pockets or finance a nation's future. What happened next would decide whether the scandal remained a whisper or became a reckoning. The bond deals were engineered with theatrical precision. Prospectuses slickly described revenue streams and projected growth. Rating reports blessed underwriter assumptions. Victor convened gala dinners where officials and bankers toasted the nation's new path. The press release language promised transformational capital. On the ground, cranes continued to rise and ceremonial ribbons were cut. Yet, behind the fanfare, the bond structure included intermediate holding companies and layers that would later be described in court filings as intentionally opaque. Investigators later described a choreography of transactions. Funds raised through bonds flowed to a state development agency, then to a special purpose vehicle, and from there to subcontractors and suppliers. Some subcontractors were legitimate, Others had been incorporated weeks earlier in jurisdictions with limited disclosure requirements. Payments for consulting, project acceleration, and logistical support read like bureaucratic absolution for capital flows that had diverted from their stated purpose. The sum total of these diversions, when pieced together, constituted a scale that staggered analysts. Billions redirected, a portion of which purchased assets abroad and underwrote lavish lifestyles. Victor's public posture did not change. He continued to frame the criticisms as partisan attacks, as the predictable pushback against a disruptive innovator. He hired communications teams who rewrote narrative arcs in press statements, emphasizing job creation numbers and signed contracts. Friends and Philanthropy reported generous donations to foundation projects that were hard to audit. The tactic was familiar: benevolence as reputational armor. But the leak expanded. Audit trails, once thought buried, surfaced through a collaboration of investigative reporters and a whistleblower inside a bank that had handled some of the flows. The whistleblower's courage, risky, costly, brought documents that suggested a pattern rather than an anomaly. The public saw emails, transfer memos, and internal notes that described structured payouts and rapid distribution. Politicians lost their language of denial. Protest numbers grew. Municipalities organized, and a coalition of labor unions and teachers marched with placards that demanded answers about hospitals and schools. As accountability took the stage, some enablers fled from the narrative. A celebrity who had been photographed at Victor's dinners scrubbed social feeds and issued a contrite statement about regretting attendance at events that now appear problematic. A prominent banker who had underwritten bond tranches quietly resigned. The minister who had once toasted Victor faced a confidence vote. His public approval numbers plummeted. The scandal moved beyond columns and talk shows. Legislators requested inquiries, and opposition parties used the evidence as the centerpiece of their campaign messaging. For Victor, the net tightened. Investigators secured subpoenas. His lawyers issued statements proclaiming his innocence and promising full cooperation. In private, aides arranged for safe house locations and contingency plans. He began to travel less publicly, his social calendar shrinking as venues once eager for his presence now received phone calls from journalists. Friends reported a change. The laugh that used to be effortless now came as an arched effort, eyes scanning exits. Yet the most consequential shift was political. In the next national election cycle, the scandal became a focal point. Campaign ads juxtaposed footage of unfinished clinics with footage of Victor at award ceremonies, of children standing before closed classrooms while luxury cars glided by in the newsreels. The opposition party tied the financial mismanagement directly to promises broken. Turnout surged in regions that had been on the losing end of investment promises. In a narrow but decisive result, an administration that had championed the public-private model was voted out, replaced by coalitions promising transparency and audit. The change in government accelerated legal inquiries. Prosecutors opened investigations into procurement processes, consultants' fees, and the ultimate beneficiaries of diverted funds. International agencies offered assistance. For the first time, the machinery of state that had been slow to act now moved with unexpected speed. Victor's fall from the high table did not happen in a single dramatic arrest on a rain-slicked street. It occurred through a series of small defeats. A frozen bank account, a subpoena served at dawn, a public testimony from a defector who had been his right hand. News feeds ran lines about alleged misappropriations and ongoing probes. His public defenders argued about presumption of innocence, while investigators assembled a mosaic of transactions that suggested pattern and intent. The human cost, meanwhile, became impossible to ignore. A coastal hospital that had been promised a new wing remained a concrete skeleton. Parents in the region shared the stories of missed vaccinations and the extra hours they spent in distant clinics. Pensions that had been promised to retired civil servants shrank as fiscal reality intruded. Some retirees who had planned their final years on those payments found themselves revising basic needs. The national budget, now strained by the loss of projected investment, cut back on social programs. The narrative of development that had justified the deals now read as a euphemism for displacement of public goods into private gain. Within months of the initial leak, Victor found himself in a foreign residence, guarded by a legal labyrinth that slowed extradition. He was no longer the man who filled gala rooms. He moved through anonymous arrivals at small airports, avoiding press gates. In interviews with a small set of sympathetic journalists, he insisted he had been a facilitator of growth, a target of politics. He spoke of errors of judgment rather than malfeasance. For some, his words carried weight. He still had friends who believed him. For others, those words were the last public gestures of a man whose influence had already been stripped away. But the accountability arc was incomplete. Prosecutors moved aggressively in some jurisdictions, securing indictments and asset freezes. In others, legal complexity and cross-border law limited the pace of action. Some assets were repatriated. Others remained entangled in nominee structures and corporate shells. Judges in foreign courts awaited documents. The public's appetite for justice clashed with the slow, procedural tempo of international law. And yet, even as legal processes unfurled, the scandal precipitated institutional change. New transparency laws were proposed. Auditing procedures were reformed. Political candidates campaigned on oversight. The outcry had produced not only indignation, but also specific policy proposals: tighter disclosure requirements for public-private partnerships, mandatory beneficial ownership registries, and independent audit authority with faster timelines. Victor's exile, whether chosen or imposed, became the symbol of a larger question. Could a nation rebuild trust in institutions after they've been bent into instruments of private gain? Citizens debated the trade-offs between speed and oversight. Technocrats argued about the cost of regulation versus the cost of corruption. The conversation that began with outrage moved over months into structural reform. Still, closure remained partial. Some funds were recovered, but a painful arithmetic remained. Billions that might have paid for teachers, medical equipment, and infrastructure were gone, at least for the foreseeable future. Families who had expected new clinics or upgraded schools found themselves recalculating priorities on much tighter budgets. That arithmetic became the moral ledger against which the entire scandal was measured. The story of Victor Hale is not only the biography of one man, it is a cautionary anatomy of how modern finance, social capital, and porous governance can combine to hollow out public projects. It is a study in how charisma can substitute for accountability, how reputational currency can be leveraged like any other asset, and how institutional weaknesses, when paired with aggressive actors, produce national losses that take generations to mend. The narrative would continue into courtrooms, into parliamentary hearings, and into the quiet work of rebuilding oversight. There would be hearings that demanded answers of banks and underwriters. There would be whistleblowers who paid dearly. And there would be, over time, reforms that attempted to translate rage into structural protections. But those developments belong to another portion of this chronicle, where legal captions, testimony, and the slow turn of justice take center stage. For now, the image that lingered in the public imagination was simple and terrible: a map of a country dotted with small crosses where promised projects were left unfinished, and a column of numbers that represented money once destined for children and healthcare, and instead spent on yachts, films, and private estates. That image galvanized an electorate, reshaped politics, and forced institutions to ask the hard question: how could the system be altered so the next charismatic operator could not do the same? Victor's story does not end with a single verdict. It ends, for the moment, with the public's resolve to know. The leak had broken open a story. The revelation set in motion a chain that would test the limits of legal systems and the patience of citizens. In the aftermath, there were lessons learned and mistakes repeated elsewhere. But one lesson stood clear: when trust is commodified, the cost is paid not by the few, but by the many. The first courtroom to open its doors to the public case was narrow and fluorescent lit, a place where the city's lesser dramas were usually decided. Landlord disputes, traffic infractions, the occasional small-fry fraud. Now it smelled of old paper and fear. The prosecutors had chosen it deliberately. a space where cameras could crowd the doorway, but where testimony might proceed without the theater of a high, ornate bench. Behind plexiglass, a man who had once signed for millions sat hunched like a schoolboy. Lionel Mercer had been Victor Hale's chief financial officer for more than a decade. A meticulous man, a soft voice that promised numbers would never betray him. When the first witness called his name, Lionel's hands folded and he did not look at the gallery. "Mr. Mercer," the prosecutor began, "you acted as signatory on accounts that ultimately paid for goods and services billed to the so-called public projects, did you not?" "Yes," Lionel said, the word thin. He spoke as if it hurt to draw breath. "How many transfers did you authorize in 2016 and 2017 that you now consider irregular?" Lionel closed his eyes. "I don't know the exact number. Dozens, perhaps more." What followed was not a clean confession, but a map of shadows. Lionel described layered instructions: a wire to a shell company in a neighboring state, another to an underwriter in a private office in Geneva, a consultant who showed no invoices, contractors who delivered nothing. His testimony was procedural and devastating because it linked bureaucracy to plunder. He testified about meetings in which phrases were softened: strategic partner, expedited approval, contingency management, until the language of governance became indistinguishable from the language of a marketable project. Outside, a crowd of citizens listened to a live feed. The faces in the gathering were ordinary: a teacher clutching a dossier of budget requests that had been denied for years, a woman who had driven 3 hours to see the gallery, her son's medical records in her bag, the surgery postponed because the clinic had never been built. Each felt the testimony as if it were a personal reckoning. Across town, in a small flat that smelled of incense and old coffee, the whistleblower who had first breached Hale's inner circle watched Lionel on a borrowed laptop. Imran, a compliance analyst who had once been hyper-loyal, had misplaced the safety of secrecy when he could no longer reconcile his paycheck with the holes he saw in the ledger. He had trained himself not to tremble under pressure. Now he watched the man he had once respected confess with halting detail. It took courage to come forward. Imran's life had been rearranged. His sister lost a job after their landlord learned of her relationship to him. His name had been dragged through forums where friends wondered aloud whether he had been paid. He had been offered relocation, a modest stipend to move outside the country, but the constancy of fear was one he could not bargain with. He kept watching. Lionel's words, he thought, would mean nothing unless others followed them with documents, invoices, emails, travel receipts, a forensic chorus that would join confession to proof. International courts moved with the deliberate pace of gears grinding into new alignments. In Geneva, a trustee whose name had been attached to a string of nominee corporations arrived to answer questions under oath. The trustee's handwriting matched a ledger entry. A judge in a foreign jurisdiction asked about beneficial ownership, and for the first time, the category broke open. The trustee's voice faltered when asked to name the person who had ultimately benefited. The reply was a litany of evasions, an appeal to privacy laws, a recitation of procedural protections by counsel trained to stall. Repatriation, when it came, was surgical and complex. Small transfers, each weighed and contested, were rerouted through formal channels. Banks negotiated settlements to avoid litigation. Some funds were seized in emergency order, others remained ringed by injunctions. Each recovery required a paper trail long enough to choke a library. Forensic accountants, the new priests of public grief, reconstructed how tiny payments became yachts, how consulting retainers became film production budgets, how corporate hospitality disguised private villas. In Parliament, the debate over reform widened into a national argument about the cost of vigilance. Technocrats produced models that plotted the expense of oversight against the estimated losses from corruption. A young legislator named Amara Kwan, who had campaigned on the urgency of transparency, stood at the podium with a file of petitions and photographs. A primary school half built, a maternity ward with rusted gutters, a pile of unused bricks where a community hall had been promised. She spoke plainly. "We are not simply passing laws to shame a man," Amara said. "We are passing laws because we cannot let future victors purchase our silence." Her voice was steady. Her caucus was small but growing. Opposition came from an unlikely coalition. Business leaders who feared bureaucracy choked innovation, some older MPs who cautioned against overreach, and a set of legislators who argued that if the state demanded too much transparency, it would drive capital away. The debate hardened into amendment after amendment. The original draft of a beneficial ownership registry, a public database listing the true owners of corporate entities, was weakened in committee. Certain exemptions were carved out for sensitive investments. Thresholds were raised so that only companies with very large turnovers would be required to disclose. Penalties were softened into fines that, critics said, read like a cost of doing business. Public pressure, however, pulled other levers. Citizens groups organized marches that cut across political lines. Teachers, nurses, and young professionals marched with banners that read, "We will not be collateral." The pressure bore fruit. A special oversight commission was created with a mandate to audit public-private partnerships and to review procurement processes within 90 days. It had teeth, limited, but teeth nonetheless. The commission moved with urgency, publishing reports that named banks that had shown willful blindness and underwriters that had failed due diligence. Media outlets dug where officials had hesitated. Claire Bennett, an investigative journalist who had covered the early leaks, continued pursuing leads overseas. She sat across a low table from a former asset manager who had quietly flipped sides, offering cooperation in exchange for immunity. He provided names and shifted the geography of culpability. Not a single country benefited from the opacities. Networks of intermediaries in multiple jurisdictions allowed money to flow like water between basins with different legal thresholds. Each revelation complicated the legal maps prosecutors had once thought simple. Then there were the quieter reckonings. In a small coastal town, villagers gathered at dusk when a truck arrived with new doors, medical equipment, and a team of volunteer carpenters. The funds used to refurbish the clinic came from the first tranche recovered after months of litigation. The clinic's sign was simple and unadorned. Children with crooked teeth and bright eyes clustered as the surgeon, a soft-spoken woman who had once had to travel hours to reach her patients, walked through the open door. She told a neighbor, "It isn't everything, but at least someone can breathe here now." These moments were not a solution. They were the first stitches in the cloth that had been torn. They were tangible proof that recovery mattered, even if only in increments. They were also a test. Could citizens be content with partial restoration, or would their appetite for justice demand persistent vigilance? Victor, in exile, watched the news like a man observing a distant storm through a pane of glass. His statements were polished. He spoke of errors, of misjudgments, of the inexorable complexities of large-scale development. He gave interviews from a villa set back from a Mediterranean road, the background landscaped and sunlit. His tone was everywhere calibrated to evoke the memory of a benefactor undone by rancor. "I sought to build," he said, "and if I failed as a man, not as a thief." The sentence landed differently depending on whom listened. For some voters, it read as an admission. For others, a plea. What Victor could not entirely escape were the quiet, juridical instruments that crept underneath rhetoric. Travel bans issued by foreign courts, an international freeze on certain accounts, subpoenas that requested correspondence between him and bankers whose names had surfaced in Lionel's testimony. Even exile demanded legal housekeeping. His lawyers produced a parade of technical arguments, jurisdictional challenges, claims of political persecution, requests to quash warrants as beyond the statute of limitations. But every response opened a new procedural avenue for prosecutors. The human cost of coming clean or being caught remained real and severe. Whistleblowers bore threats. Lionel asked in a private moment before the court adjourned for the day about protection for his family. He had given years to a system that had collapsed under his oversight. The prosecutor, a woman named Nadia Rojas, promised that the witness program would be robust. Nadia had built her career on cases that started as paperwork errors and ended as public crises. She had nights when the enormity of the task woke her, how to reconstruct trust when an entire scaffolding of civic faith had been eroded. Her answer was simple in philosophy and in practice: relentless documentation. Show, don't incant, she liked to say. We will need ledgers, signed invoices, travel logs, emails. Give us the trail that will convince a court, not just a crowd. Not every institution was reformed completely. Several banks paid settlements and accepted changes to their compliance units, yet continued to lobby vigorously against overly broad disclosure measures. Some politicians who had championed reform found their bills neutered in committee, their names appended to amendments that diluted effect. There were also victories that surprised no one. Audit offices were reconstituted with digital access. Procurement portals went live so open tenders could be tracked. And an independent auditor's report, once a closed document, became public for the first time. The slow work of rebuilding also required new kinds of civic literacy. Nonprofits sprang up to teach citizens how to read contracts, how to file complaints, how to track the progress of a public project. High school civics classes began, tentatively, then with more confidence, to include modules on public finance and procurement. The public, who had once treated budgets as a distant technicality, began to attend hearings in small groups, to submit FOIA requests, to ask blunt questions in town halls. Yet fatigue was inevitable. Years of hearings and court dates stretched patience thin. New scandals elsewhere competed for outrage. The tempo of news cycles favored fresh transgressions over long, complex recoveries. Some citizens tired of the proceduralism and demanded quick verdicts. Activists warned against the lure of punitive impatience. Justice, too rushed, could be injustice masquerading as satisfaction. In the rare quiet hours when the courthouse emptied and the journalists had gone home to transcribe their notes, a junior prosecutor sat alone among stacks of photocopies. He had been promoted from a clerkship and admired Nadia's relentless appetite for detail. He flipped through pages of invoices and tentative payments, tracing names that recurred like a pattern in the weave of a rug. His mind kept returning to an image from the first leak, a map dotted with small crosses over unfinished projects. He had come to the office convinced that this case was about punishment. Now he understood it had to be about prevention. Can you imagine, he mused aloud to no one, a system where early indicators would flag these pathways? Where risk models wouldn't simply be the province of bank compliance, but part of civic oversight? Where procurement didn't require months of guessing? The question was not rhetorical. It became the agenda for a new task force convened by Parliament, drawing together auditors, civic tech developers, procurement experts, and representatives of the very communities whose projects had been lost. They sketched out a dashboard, a public interface, where each planned project would have a timeline, a budget, and a list of contracted entities. It was ambitious and naive, and necessary. The work was technical and political, requiring both coding and consensus. When volunteers gathered to populate the first pilot projects, there was the inevitable mix of euphoria and skepticism. The dashboard would not prevent a Victor Hale from emerging. It might, however, make it harder for one to operate in the dark. And so the country moved forward in fitful increments. There were prosecutions and acquittals, fund recoveries and losses, reforms passed and watered down. For many citizens, especially those who had lost a child to an absent clinic or a family member to an untreated illness, the pace of justice was a poor comfort. For others, each recovered tranche and each refurbished classroom was a small vindication. Victor's image never left the papers. In exile, he cultivated a careful resentment, a narrative of victimhood that found sympathetic ears in certain salons and investing circles. Yet his name was no longer an untroubled token of influence. It had been scoured, paradoxically, both of meaning and of power. Stripped of easy legitimacy, it was left to the slow arithmetic of law. At the end of another long day, the small coastal clinic reopened fully for the first time in years. The surgeon illuminated a ceiling light and smiled.
A boy with a fever sat in a chair and was given medicine that would keep him home from the hospital this time. Inside, a faded poster reminded the staff of why they had stayed. "Health is the first form of hope," it read, the words hand-painted by volunteers. Outside, near the gate, a crowd gathered as dusk deepened. They did not burn effigies. They did not shout for vengeance. Instead, they spoke in low voices about what else needed doing: the school that still lacked a roof, the bus route that had never been funded. They discussed a petition to keep the Oversight Commission funded for another year. They knew the work of rebuilding was long, and they had come to the quiet conclusion that endurance would be the chief virtue. In the galleries of power, in the slow ticking of court calendars, in the white rooms of clinics, and the crowded halls of town meetings, the country kept its ledger, morally, painfully, insistently. The scandal that Victor Hale symbolized had changed the texture of public life. It had exposed the vulnerabilities of systems that once seemed impermeable. It had also taught, in the granular way of human institutions, that reform required more than indignation. It needed patient craftsmanship, legal muscle, civic education, and a willingness to fight over mundane rules. There was no neat ending, no single verdict that could reverse lost years. But there were small recoveries and legal precedents, communities that rebuilt one project at a time.
Time, and a generation learning to read the fine print of governance. The image of the map with its tiny crosses endured, not as a tombstone, but as a ledger that would be consulted whenever new contracts were drawn and new promises made. For now, the country walked on, bruised and deliberate, knowing that the next battle would not be the last, and that the real test was whether institutions could be fashioned so that trust would no longer be an easily traded commodity. The first annual report of the Oversight Commission arrived on a damp morning, folded into the paper with the steady, official weight of a thing meant to be kept. It opened with figures and footnotes, and the kind of language that must exist to be taken seriously in committee rooms: percentages, compliance rates, lists of recommendations. But beneath the tables were the stories that made the numbers speak. The report named projects restored, contractors barred, funds reclaimed. It named towns where roofs had been rebuilt, and clinics where medicine now sat in orderly shelves. It named the audit that had exposed the pattern of shell companies. It named gaps that remained. At the public hearing that followed, citizens lined the benches and spoke in turns. A woman from an inland village held out a photograph of her daughter at a new school, crooked smile in the sun. An elderly teacher unfolded a ledger and read aloud the months when the bus had not come, when pupils missed school and the turnout fell away. A young man representing the volunteers who had repainted the clinic spoke with hands that still smelled of paint, and then, quietly, of worry. The distributor scheduled to supply vaccines had yet to be contracted under the new rules. The Commission's monitoring software showed the procurement delayed by bureaucratic holdups. The commissioners listened, some with the weary civility of officials who have seen more trouble than cheer, some with the fierce attention of people newly lived to the fact that oversight is maintenance, not a finishing line. One commissioner, an auditor whose face the press had learned to photograph stern and purposeful, spoke of the dashboard's early successes and its early failures. Algorithms had flagged patterns that led to fruitful inquiries. But data was not destiny. Incomplete records, old habits of off-books dealing, and the centrifugal pull of political compromises all bent the system toward old ways, unless someone kept refusing the bend. Outside, Jamal hunched over a laptop under a street lamp, the pilot dashboard open to a public feed. He had been one of the civic technologists who volunteered to build the interface. Simple timelines where a citizen could see at a glance when a contract was issued, who signed it, and whether the payments matched the deliveries. He had written the code to present not only sums and dates, but also a mute, stubborn commentary, red flags, color-coded days of delay, a history of complaints attached to contracts like thin, visible scars. Volunteers, across the country had begun to populate the entries, painstakingly transcribing minutes from dusty civic offices and matching scanned invoices to what they could find. Jamal's phone buzzed, a message from a volunteer in a mountainous district reporting a missing invoice recovered from a nameless folder. He smiled and thought of the boy at the clinic, and of the poster on the wall that said, in volunteer paint, that health is hope. He felt for the first time the thin, electrified thrill of making something that could be held up and shown to someone who had been told only excuses. But he also felt the other thing, the quiet enfranchisement of those who would not be satisfied. The dashboard was a tool, and the people were the power behind it. That, he knew, would always be the more fragile thing. In a newsroom a few blocks away, Miriam, a prosecutor, prepared for an appeal. She had spent a year unraveling contracts and following bank ledgers into jurisdictions that liked the anonymity of distance. Her office smelled of coffee and paper and the stubborn metallic scent of arguments not yet resolved. The case at hand was not Victor Hale's final tie. Those had stretched into other courts and other petitions. But a lesser, cultivated partner who had attempted to skirt a newly tightened clause. Miriam's notes were exacting. She had practiced the sequence of evidence until it sat on the tongue like a small, bitter herb. Victory here would not erase the larger ruin, but it would make precedent. She told herself that precedents mined from small victories were the scaffolding of longer change. Victor, in exile, read the public hearings through second-hand reports. He cultivated a careful distance from the rancor in the papers, letting his spokespeople speak of constriction and vendettas. He had not given up on influence. He had repurposed it into networks that trafficked in softer currencies, investment promises, hospitality, quiet dinners, where memories were recast as grievances, and the memory of power was kept alive not by the former holdings themselves, but by the impression that those holdings might be restored. That narrative found shelter among a diminishing set of patrons, and there, under the chandeliers of consolation, he tended it like a plant coaxed to live in too little light. Back in the coastal town, the surgeon who had flipped the clinic's new ceiling light began to meet with a small group of volunteers each Thursday. They called themselves, informally, the caretakers, people who had stayed when others had fled the long drought of delays. They kept inventories, negotiated with regional suppliers, and wrote grant applications with pens that knew how to make a plea sound like a plan. They celebrated when a medicine shipment arrived on time. They argued late into the night when the regional transport authority failed to prioritize routes for rural clinics. Their victories were punctuated by appointments and long lists of things not yet accomplished. Children at the school tested a new civic lesson that
the volunteers had insisted on a basic line item. In a classroom that still smelled of fresh paint, Leela raised her hand and asked what a procurement was, having heard the word in the town meeting. The teacher, who had been a clerk before she became an educator, drew a simple analogy. Procurement was like choosing who cooks the town meal. The class laughed, then grew thoughtful as the teacher explained why the town must know who was cooking, what ingredients were bought, and who had paid for the firewood. They practiced labeling a mock budget on pieces of scrap paper. The ledger, once a symbol of loss, had entered the curriculum as a civic object. There were setbacks. In a neighboring county, a junior official in procurement resigned amid allegations of undue pressure from politicians who argued that transparency stymied efficiency. The headline read, for 1 week, like a defense. Volunteers traveled to the county to coax documents out of locked cabinets and to interview clerks who feared reprisals. The dashboard showed days of delay in orange and red. The public, when shown the colors, asked questions that were at once naive and potent. They asked how a contract could move from tender to payment without physical delivery. They demanded answers. Some answers were technical, some moral, and many were political. The legal reforms, too, proved porous. New clauses closed some routes of embezzlement, others opened elsewhere. Lawmakers negotiated amendments after midnight, the bleary negotiations of people trying to stitch a law to a reality they did not fully share. Some elected officials championed the changes loudly. Others offered only the quiet, procedural support that evaporated under pressure. The Oversight Commission found itself under renewed attack by those who claimed it overstepped. In small-town cafes and central plazas, conversations that had once been resigned bleakness turned toward strategy. Attend the next hearing, sign the petition, demand the budget line. Patience spread like a practice. Miriam, after a late appeal hearing, walked to the pier and paused. She watched a fisherman mend a net with the patient fingers of a person who measured time by tides. Her mind kept returning to a line from a witness statement she could not forget. The mother who had said, simply, that when the ambulance came late, it took more than time with it. The prosecutor felt the accumulative weight of such small losses and small recoveries. She also felt the loneliness of being the one who must catalog them into cases. She returned to her office and drafted the brief with new clarity. Legal muscle, she believed, was not only enforcement, it was the architecture that made persuasion durable. At night, in a small room where the press still gathered, journalists traced connections on a board of pins. Names, companies, phone records. Sometimes the file stopped because there was nothing more to find, and sometimes it opened into a chamber of new leads. One young reporter, new to the city and hungry for
truth rather than headlines, sat long into the night wheeling between data sheets and interviews. He wrote a piece about the artisans of oversight, the volunteers who transcribed, the clerk who risked his job to hand over invoices, the teacher who taught procurement to 10-year-olds. The piece did not indict a single villain. It instead described the slow, deliberate reknitting of civic trust. And yet the map with crosses, now a framed thing in a municipal lobby, continued to trouble the town. People still pointed to it. Children ran fingers along the lines. Elders tapped at the tiny paper marks with grave, practical gestures. At a council meeting, a new cross was drawn beside a small circle, an approved water well, motioned in and funded after months of petitions. Someone in the back of the room made a note of the date and the contractor. They applauded quietly, because they knew to save louder celebrations for when the pumps turned and the children's buckets filled without a rationed schedule. Hope in that country learned to speak in smaller sentences. It learned that patience was not passive, but active, a stubborn refusal to be surprised by delay. It learned that laws needed caretakers, and that dashboards needed people willing to read them. It learned, perhaps most importantly, that scandals changed the way people read each other's promises, and that the habit of checking was itself a civic skill to be taught across kitchen tables and school desks. Victor's name still floated on certain breathings of the elite. He filed appeals and accepted guests who brought with them investment proposals that were, on careful inspection, complex arrangements of influence and obscurity. He kept one hand always extended toward the possibility of return. Behind him, however, the comet of his simpler authority had already cooled. His brand of power, concentration without scrutiny, had been cracked and did not fix easily. Others tried to step into the fissure, and some succeeded in small measures, but the country by then had learned to look for the ledger. In its marrow way, that ledger, framed, digitally searchable, taught in schools, became a civic talisman. It did not banish corruption. It did not make procurement heroic or fast, but it made an argument plain, that institutions are not self-healing, that reform is a long, scrappy thing that asks for a certain kind of stubbornness. People who once accepted that the state had to be a black box now read its seams, and, with the new vocabulary, asked questions that could not be easily muffled. The surgeon, the teacher, the prosecutor, the coder, the volunteer, they did not become saints. They became the ordinary chorus that holds a public life together, imperfect, attentive, often quarrelsome, and resolute. They met regularly in small bureaucratic ways, over grant forms, over committee minutes, over late-night messages about delivery schedules, because those small acts were the tissue of endurance. On a clear morning months later, a boy from the coastal clinic ran into the teacher's classroom clutching a paper. A drawing of a pump, its handle upraised like an invitation. The teacher pinned it to the board beside the town's ledger. The room filled with the small music of children's planning: how to carry a bucket, where to plant a sapling by the well,
how to mark the day on the town calendar. Outside, council workers arrived to set the pump in place. People watched as the spout poured clear water, an ordinary miracle, into waiting hands. The ledger's crosses remained, but now a few were tiny green dots. The town kept counting, neither triumphant nor defeated. They kept measuring, minute by minute, meeting by meeting, contract by contract. They had learned that justice could be a process without a single headline, and that recovery was more often an accumulation of small, stubborn acts. And so the country went on, insisting, repairing, litigating, teaching, and attending to the long, slow work of making promises harder to sell and easier to verify. The lesson of the scandal had not been a tale of final retribution, but a curriculum in vigilance. The people who had once been counted as collateral stopped being so easily counted out. They learned to keep their own ledger, one small cross and one small green dot at a time.